Okay. Today we're going to pick up where we left off on Monday, talking about the motion picture industry. And we will continue this series of lectures next Monday by talking about the finances in the motion picture industry. So that will be our lecture on Monday. Friday you will have a test. Again, I'm going to make it available online. That is my preferred method of you taking it. Again, we'll take it in class, so bring your computers. If you do want to take it for some reason on paper, send me an email, let me know. Hopefully most of you will, again, take that via the computer. It's a lot more convenient for both of us. It makes it a lot easier in terms of taking the test, and it makes it a lot easier in terms of grading the test. So, in fact, you get substantially all your grade on Friday, I think, right? When you finished, it told you which ones you got correct and which ones you didn't, right? So, makes it a little easier on all of us. Those of you online, I will make that test available starting midnight on Thursday, and probably leave it up for about a week for those of you online to take it. So, any questions about that? I think it's 35 questions worth approximately 3 points each, plus a bonus discussion question worth up to 10 points. Okay? And that's in addition to the 100. So, all right. Let's talk about producers. We set the stage for the motion picture industry. We talked a little bit about the history. Producers and production companies, and we'll group those two together, make up a big part of what is involved in the production of a motion picture. As we looked at earlier, there are two phases to the movie industry, and one is the production, the other is the distribution. Production, of course, creates the product. It is what sells. It is what people go to watch. But what does a producer do? What does a production company do? Well, one glossary defines it this way. The producer is the chief of a movie production in all logistical matters, and that includes scheduling, budgeting, hiring, basically anything that goes into making a motion picture. Everything, for the most part, except for the creative efforts of the director, who actually sits with the actors, the videographers, and creates the product. But the producer is in charge, of course, of the director. So the producer raises the funding, and he raises the financing. So his or hers is a very responsible position. One important component that is often overlooked with regard to the production company is that they acquire the story, or they develop it. They hire script writers, they write it themselves, they find works that have already been written, they obtain those. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Then once they've acquired that story, once they've written that story, then they have to finalize it. A lot goes into producing the movies that you watch out at Thoroughbred or in Green Hills. People rewrite the script. We edit the script. So they finalize it and make it into something that people will want to watch. And then once that is done, they start hiring key personnel. Now, this may be done simultaneously, but once they figure out the parts that they need, they begin to fill those parts with actors and actresses. And then next they arrange for the distribution of the film to theaters. Again, without ultimately getting it into a theater, there's no revenue generated by the movie. And then finally, they serve as the liaison between the financiers and the filmmakers, while managing the production of the film from start to finish. So they get the money, they hire the people, they get it done. And then they arrange for its distribution. So basically the production company or the producer is involved at every stage of the making of the film. There's one anecdote that says he is the first person on the set and then the last person on the set. In short, the most critical person in the part of a production. So how does this happen? How does the producer get from conception to final product? Well, if he wants to raise money, which most producers do, making a film costs money, he has to have something to show people to make them interested. Most of us are familiar with the music industry. In the music industry, we call this what? A demo record, right? We all make a demo. It used to be a cassette tape. Now, of course, we put it on Dropbox and just send an email, but it's the same concept. You make a demo recording, and you shop that recording. We looked at this a little bit in the music supervision section. So the same thing happens in the movie industry. The producer makes basically a demo reel to get people excited about the film. But it's more than just a demo reel. It's a package that they can show the financier. The package consists of several components. Typically, it will include, of course, the script. That is probably the most important component. It will also consist of a list of stars. Once the producer finalizes the script or gets it close to final, he will start assembling his cast of stars. He will possibly have some sort of initial agreement with those stars, maybe even paper, when he starts to shop the package. And importantly for the investor, they're going to want to see a budget. How much of my money do you plan to spend? So the budget will be very carefully detailed. If any of you have ever done a business plan, most movie budgets look somewhat like a spreadsheet that you would attach to a business plan. Normally, you will have hired or have on hand a director, or perhaps even a list of directors that you anticipate using. And of course, all of these elements are fluid. Once a production company begins to conceptualize, begins to acquire scripts, hire actors, things happen, schedules conflict. Perhaps the director is filming another movie at the time you plan to film your movie. Perhaps the actors are in the same situation. So all these things can change in the package as you go through the process of funding and ultimately filming. It's unusual for these things to take years to develop and finalize, from conception into the final production of the movie, because all of these things have to converge at the same time. If you really want Tom Hanks for your starring role, you're going to have to make sure that everything else aligns with that star in order to get the package developed and funded. And it's not easy. Obviously, the more money you need, the harder it is to get produced. It's not easy to raise production funds. And the sources of funding, as we've seen, are not always easy. There are banks that specialize in movie industry funding, but for the most part, you're not going to get your funding from the bank. You're going to get them from either a joint venture firm or a private angel investor. Sometimes it's a group of investors that decide to invest in the movie. There are special groups, special joint venture groups, that all they do is entertainment media products. They're few and far between, and they're hard to find, but they're out there. So you have special investor pools. Most of the time, that's going to be private individuals that the production company is familiar with, people they've gone to before, people who have invested in their movies before, people who have had success with them producing films. If you can't get private funding, you have to go to public funding. Public funding comes from a variety of sources. There are many art funds across the globe. Some countries will pay people a lot of money to come to their country and make a movie. Nashville recently, in the last 10 years, developed an art council, a group of professionals with connections in the industry, and their sole purpose was to bring film and arts into Nashville, bring more than music into Nashville. You are starting to see the results of that. You have seen the results of that in things like the series Nashville that a lot of us watch now on a regular basis. Several movies have been filmed here in Nashville and distributed. That's all as a result of the art funds that are set up. And sometimes these art funds can be added to things called subsidies. If a city or a country or a state really wants art to come into its community, it will give them tax subsidies. Come into our community, you will be able to film and buy things tax-free. So they'll waive any taxes as a subsidy, or perhaps even give them money in addition to waiving subsidies, in addition to the art funds. Art funds you apply for through usually a council or a committee. Subsidies are generally come directly from the location. Both similar in that you're getting your money, but you obtain them different ways. As of fiscal year 2010, 43 states offered some sort of entertainment subsidy equaling about $1.5 billion for the sole purpose of attracting film and TV production into their state. So most of the states, with the exception of a few outliers, have this kind of funding. Mid-range states in the middle of the pack, give producers a subsidy worth about 25 cents of every dollar of subsidized production expense. In other words, if you have raised, let's say, $1 million, then the state's going to give you $250,000. Not a bad deal. So all you have to do is go out there and find your first million, and you can then turn that into a little bit better profit. Alaska and Michigan are the highest. They give 44 and 42 respectively for a subsidy. So if you're willing to film your movie in Alaska or Michigan, you can raise $1 million, and then you can effectively have $1.5 million to shoot your film. Not a bad deal. As I said earlier, they also offer tax benefits, sometimes credits for the privilege of getting their business. All of this because of the inherent risk involved in shooting a film. You can spend a lot of money making a movie, making a series, and end up with very little profits at all. It is risky. That's why there are so few joint venture firms that specialize in this media. But it is also why states like to gamble with it and offer these subsidies. With any kind of risky investment comes the potential for huge gains. As you're starting to see with the Nashville community, those huge gains can come in the sense of notoriety, additional tourism, things which help the community grow. So sometimes they are worth the risk. And consequently, the competition among the states is very fierce to obtain these kinds of things. Tennessee law that gives this subsidy is TCA Section 4-3-4903C. And that is Tennessee's current subsidy, and that is 25 cents on the dollar. That's administered by the commission I mentioned earlier, the Tennessee Film, Entertainment, and Music Commission. And as I said, the result of this has been evident of late. We started to see things pop out of Nashville that are very good for the community and give us a lot of revenues. This show has been estimated by local authorities, researchers, to have brought in around $75 million in local revenues for the first season that it was out. And of course, it's in its second season now. So let's estimate that production on this is somewhere in the $5 to $10 million range. The state had to cough up about possibly up to $2 million, but $2 million to reap a $75 million profit or revenues, not a bad risk. That's why states engage in this practice of subsidies. Now, we talked about financing. But what about the script? How do we obtain a good script for our movie or for our television production or for whatever we're doing, whatever project we're working on? You want the best. You want to hire good authors, good script writers. So how do you do that? Well, there are a lot of ways. One of the most important ways legally that you can obtain a property with a smaller amount of funding is through something called an option. And then when you're developing that particular book, you have something to take to the investor and say, look, I've got an option on John Grisham's latest novel. Here it is. How much are you willing to invest? Here's my budget. Here's my list of stars. I need a funder. And that is going to be a very powerful thing. So the option is usually in writing. You usually have a contract. You will acquire the rights, or you have the option to acquire the rights based on a certain amount of funding. And then you take that and put it in your package and take it to the appropriate funding parties. An option is a legal agreement. It gives the party the right to basically have the option to buy a literary property or release a literary property without the legal obligation to pay the full amount until that option is exercised. So the way it works is I go to an author and I say, I will give you $50,000 for the option to make a movie out of your book and to write a script and to make a movie. Depending on who the author is, you're not going to get John Grisham for $50,000, but depending on who the author is, that's a pretty good amount. And then ultimately, if I make the movie, if I turn it into a movie and it gets funded and it gets distributed, I will give you $1 million. And perhaps if I'm the author, I'm going to want a small percent of the net revenues of the movie. Perhaps not. So that's how an option works. I pay the author $50,000, and then I have a period of time, whatever I negotiate, in which to develop my package, obtain my list of stars, obtain my directors, get all my funding in place, get my distribution in place, all for $50,000. And I don't have to come up with $1 million to do this. So you can see how this tool, this legal tool, can be a very flexible thing in developing your movie package. They are purchased for a small percentage of the ultimate price. And they give the optionee a period, let's say, of 2 years in which to shop that package and get it put together. If the option is exercised, the purchaser ultimately pays the big price. And of course, that's offset by the small amount that you invested usually. But at that point, when the option is exercised, you pay the $1 million. And you acquire the property. If you don't exercise the option, the author still gets to keep that $50,000. So it's a win-win for the author. The author knows something happens with this, I'm going to get $1 million. Nothing happens with it, I still get my option fee. And that's what makes it worth waiting a year, 2 years for your money. After the option period expires, the seller has no further obligation to sell the property. Just a few examples of this. 1993, John Grisham's The Firm becomes a runaway hit. The film earned $158 million in domestic gross and another $111 million in foreign. As we looked at earlier in this lecture, that's a pretty good draw for a movie. The movie probably cost about $50 million to make, so they quadrupled their money easily. Grisham instantly became a hot commodity as an author. Hollywood knows, okay, this guy has a knack, so let's see what else he's got. It allowed Grisham to close his law practice and begin writing books full time, most of which were optioned by studios before they came out, were published. Some even before they were even written were optioned. Pelican Brief, The Client, all became huge movies. About a year later, Brian Grazer optioned The Chamber for $3.75 million based simply on the synopsis of the book. So turn this $50,000 into 3.75 and you have John Grisham's deal. We don't know what the ultimate price was. He probably got a huge percentage of the revenues in the movie. Not bad for a synopsis, which probably was not even entitled to copyright protection. 1996, his first novel, A Time to Kill, was optioned to New Regency. Once they secured Sandra Bullock and Matthew McConaughey, Warner paid $6 million to purchase the rights. So that gives you the idea of the kind of numbers we're talking about. You get a famous author. You get his first work. You get Sandra Bullock. You get Matthew McConaughey. You get them locked in. You go to Warner Brothers, and they pay you $6 million for the rights to distribute that movie. So then you've got $6 million. You turn that around, you go to a state like Alaska or Michigan, if you want to film it in Detroit, and you get 50 cents on the dollar, you've now got $9 million to produce your movie. So now we're starting to see how the funding multiplies and how things happen in the movie industry. And that was, of course, at the time when Grisham was considered a not miss property or a can't miss property. These days, or at least in the 90s and 2000s, it was difficult to get that kind of money. We're starting to see a turnaround with events like Nashville and like some of the movies that are coming out of Nashville, out of Memphis, out of Hollywood. You're starting to see the numbers go back up. So the opportunities are there for people like you who want to go out and start production companies and want to be producers. You're starting to see the money, the numbers go back up to these can't miss numbers. Another example of Grisham, Testament became a best-selling novel in 1999. He waited 10 years for the option on that book, again fetching 6 figures. So if you're an author, if you're a writer on that side of the business, timing is crucial. If you can hang on to your first book, if you can hang on to a best-selling book for a period of time, then the value of that may or may not go up. It's kind of like stocks. When you're taking a gamble, because it might go down, depending on what happens with your books. But if you're very confident, if you're doing well, then you can time these things and make a lot more money. That was bought out, by the way, by a Nashville-based group as well that ultimately ended up making the film. And finally, one final method of achieving some of these goals and getting a distribution company interested or a movie house interested is through what we call a development deal. Again, you have parts of your package already in place, and you're starting to see a little light at the end of the tunnel. Then you can go to a movie company or a distributor and say, look, I'd like to enter into a development deal with you. I'd like to enter into an agreement giving you the option to take my movie once and if it gets produced. And sometimes they will pay money at that stage of the game through a development deal. This can end up being a great thing, or as it says here, it could end up being development hell. The movie houses control you at that point. A lot of different things can happen along the way with the package, and often do, as life often does. And then arguably you're no longer an independent, but you're at the whims of the company. And then once you get the movie produced, it has to go through the board of directors, through the president, through the whole process that you as an independent probably don't want. Because the fundamental decisions at that point transfer to whoever you have the development deal with. So some of the selection of the screenwriter, the cast, all of these things can be subject to the distributor or the movie house at that point. You no longer can control your destiny. So it can be a good thing. It can also be very difficult. A development deal, from a legal standpoint, usually starts with what we call a deal memo. If you've had any experience in the music industry, you know these are not unique to the movie industry. Purpose of the deal memo is to have some sort of legally binding agreement that doesn't take 2 years to negotiate. In other words, you have the most salient points set out in the deal memo, and you make it a binding agreement. Now, there are various forms of these. Sometimes you might see something called a letter of intent. In most cases, these are non-binding, but it gets confusing because the deal memo can sometimes be non-binding as well, or the deal memo can take the form of an option. So as an attorney, whenever you see something called a deal memo or a letter of intent, your first question is going to be, why aren't we doing an agreement? The motivation may be different for some companies. They may not want to invest the kind of money that would be required for an agreement. So a deal memo is a good way to test the waters. In the recording industry, you often see the deal memo in something like a record label saying to a young artist, we'll give you $20,000 to go in and record 2 songs. See what you got. And then when you do that, we have the option to enter into a recording agreement with you. Well, the same thing happens in the movie industry. You have a binding agreement in which a production company is funded by either a distributor or a movie house, and they have the option then to release the film if they like it. and perhaps you produce a 20-minute sizzle reel or a 5-minute sizzle reel that shows the movie house or the distributor what you got. Shows them that you can actually perform under the full agreement. There's a lot of advantages to these. They're sometimes easier to obtain than a full-blown agreement. But they also indicate a certain level of uncertainness about your talents. It means, for example, in the record label, that they're not really sure whether you're an artist of the caliber that they want on their label. They want to wait and see. They want the opportunity to lock you up, but they want to see what you got. And it's the same with the movie industry as well. They want to see if you can produce, but they want to lock you up. So they can be a two-edged sword, so you have to be careful with deal memos. As I said, there are a list of bullet points in the deal to which both parties agree. They're short form. They're usually binding, but they usually will have some statement that we intend to make this a full-blown agreement at some point in the future, but in the meantime, this is a binding deal agreement between the two of us. Usually in the movie industry, it will include the salary of the producer. It will include some sort of milestones for the producer to reach. We want a sizzle reel by in 30 days. We want a 20-minute segment in 60 days, et cetera, et cetera. We want the finished raw film in 6 months, et cetera, et cetera. Or perhaps it's based on the producer getting the appropriate stars involved, or the appropriate director, et cetera, et cetera. It'll often include the credit on the screen. It may include things like advertising material, percentage participation by various people, and it will always include some statement about the turnaround rights, the rights that the production house has and the studio has when this thing flips into their possession. Those are called turnaround rights. And that includes the studio's right to recoup cost if the project is successfully set up somewhere else. So if the movie house invests $50,000, then they have the right to recoup that even if they don't end up producing the film. It's usually a step deal, as I indicated. You have a number of terms. If you meet the milestones, then certain things happen. So it's done in steps or increments. Step one might be the outline of the screenplay or a first draft, et cetera, et cetera. And the studio always retains the right to stop the process at any point along the development. And then, of course, once certain milestones are met, then you start negotiating the full-blown detailed agreement that will be the basis of your relationship from there on out. Sometimes the deal memo might allow the producer to obtain some income while he's producing the film. Studios recognize that producers have families, they have to eat, so sometimes they will allow for a salary to be drawn, sometimes not. The real money always comes only after the film is subsequently financed, distributed, and begins selling in the theaters. And that is something we're going to be looking at on Monday. So this really brings the producer full circle in the process. And it's just a way of creatively coming up with the financing and the funding for a movie. Does anybody in here want to produce movies, want to be in the production business? Yeah? Have you started producing anything independently yet? Okay. Nothing at all. All right. Well, let's end here. You're going to get a little bit of an early break. I'm going to go over again on Monday the financing, what happens with the money and some of the deals in place with artists and producers, etc., where the money goes, that kind of thing on Monday. You will have a test on Friday Again, I prefer if you bring your laptops. I have it available to you online. That is the better way to take it. If you want to take it by paper, please shoot me an email so that I will have it available for you in class on Friday. Everybody understand? Okay. Does anybody know right now whether they want to take it in writing? Got Amber. Anybody else? Okay. I will make one copy of the test unless I hear otherwise. You guys have a good day. I'll see you Friday. Yeah.